Hey everyone, it's Raghu, and I'm back with Mindrolling and with somebody who's, you can't say an old friend, because I've known, well, she is that, but we've known each other an awful long time because of her dad, who I went to India with, and Madison Margolin. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So Madison and her partner, Shelby Hartman, who started the magazine DoubleBlind, which some of you may know, which addresses psychedelic matters. And we're going to hear how this came together, but this is just a beautiful book. I got to tell you, though, I didn't expect to hear everybody. Here's the... Yeah, I mean, this cost a pretty penny for them to print. I'll say that. Wow. Okay, how did it come together, and how does it relate to the magazine? Is it a compilation of magazine stuff, or you've done original text to go along with that? How did it work?
So DoubleBlind came into being in 2018. Shelby was meditating and had this idea for a psychedelic magazine popped into her, and she contacted me. And we had been in touch before. We were in journalism school together. We actually didn't know each other while we were in grad school, but had very similar paths afterward, covering cannabis and psychedelics for a lot of the same publications like Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Week, stuff like that. And I think at one point, what happened actually was that Shelby interviewed my dad, who is a weed lawyer. You know that, but maybe the audience doesn't know it. She had interviewed him for a story, I think for LA Weekly. And he said, "Oh, you went to Columbia Journalism School. You must know my daughter."
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he actually made the shidduch that he put Shelby and I together. And he said, "You guys have to meet each other. How could it be that, you were in grad school at the same time and never met and now are doing similar things?" So that Shelby reached out to me. I think we got coffee. And then at some point along the way, I asked her if she wanted to apply to a grant with NPR to do a psychedelic podcast. And at the time is when the name for a podcast, DoubleBlind, got floated. And that never came into being. I don't even remember if we fully applied or if we got it, whatever. But at the point when, several months later, Shelby was just kind of sitting on her meditation pillow, and this idea for a magazine came into mind, she called me. And so it started off as a print magazine, and a lot of our a lot of like the way that we wanted to envision the magazine was through a very elevated aesthetic. So it wasn't just like good journalism, like with, like journalistic standards coming from straight out of journalism school, but also with an aesthetic to like match that standard. And so we started off as a print magazine and put the articles online. And this book that you're now reading includes both a lot of stories that were taken from previous issues of the magazine, as well as original content that we wrote for the book. So it's kind of like this evergreen compilation of DoubleBlind content with an educational thrust. It really is a guidebook. So for anyone looking to start their relationship with psychedelics or look into a specific psychedelic more, with more information, the book is a good place to start.
Yeah, no, it's chocked with information for sure. Let's talk about, well, actually, how about this thing with Ibogaine? I mean, that's on so many people's minds, what happened with the administration pushing that. And also, I don't even know exactly what they did with the marijuana cannabis laws. What do you know about all this?
Yeah, what do I know about all of this is that this has been like a decades-long journey into sort of getting the federal government to pay attention to these substances. And so we're looking at like both rescheduling and sort of opening things up for clinical research, which is great to a degree. There's a lot of advocates out there, especially in the cannabis world, who say that rescheduling is just a form of criminalization, because because basically it creates a regulatory framework that automatically leaves certain people out. And so the only recourse for them would be the underground. Okay, so with regard to cannabis, the regulatory framework that, comes into play with like a rescheduling looks positive, and to a degree it is, especially for people who only want to access cannabis through a medicalized system. But for people who are operating outside that system, it doesn't really provide a lot of protection. And in fact, it might even cause, degree of criminalization. So there's that on the weed front. With Ibogaine in particular, I do think Ibogaine is a very unique psychedelic in that it offers a lot of promise for very particular issues, including opiate addiction and Parkinson's. And the
Parkinson's. Oh, I never heard about that. Can you say
yeah,
what's that about?
I cannot tell you the science behind it, but I do
Hmm.
know that Ibogaine advocate and longtime cannabis advocate Dana Beal is highly passionate about this topic.
Really?
And yes, again, I don't know what like the science, but he says it's for opioid addiction, which everyone I think knows that part about Ibogaine, and Parkinson's. So, anyways, like the idea that people will, God willing, be able to legally access Ibogaine treatment within the United States and not necessarily have to travel out of the country is very promising. Also, there is not a large underground market for Ibogaine per se, so it's not the same dynamic as with cannabis.
Hmm.
And I do think also the clinicalization, whatever the word is,
Hmm.
of Ibogaine and ketamine and whatever, and we're seeing this also with psilocybin and MDMA and so forth, does, you know, kind of like foretell the existence of a clinical market where people can go into a clinic, get a treatment as they do with ketamine. Hopefully that comes with preparation and integration. And so we're seeing kind of models for this crop up already with ketamine.
Hmm.
With Ibogaine would be a much different story. It's like a 24-hour trip and you have to have an EKG and all sorts of, other infrastructure in place. But that's kind of the model that we're seeing from like the legalized clinical perspective. But again, as far as I would say, my concern is that this promotes the idea that there's a right way to do psychedelics, and that quote unquote right way to do it is the legal way, is the clinical medical way. And
Hmm.
I don't subscribe to that as like a whole as a holistic truth. So again, I'd say decriminalization, it offers a lot more opportunity for people to engage with these medicines in a variety of ways.
Hmm. Can we go back to Ibogaine and Parkinson's? I mean, I know plenty of, well, okay, I know a few people, but particularly my father,
Mhm.
who passed as a result of Parkinson's or not. I have no idea. It may not have been. But do you, you may or may not know it. Do you know of experiments being done with people with Parkinson's using Ibogaine to any successful outcome?
I can't say I have a lot of like perspective into that. I think I do. I hate to say that I'm like sort of mixing up my like old age illnesses because I do know somebody who does have what I don't know if it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's because I don't know how that presents differently. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. I don't
Mm,
know anyone
okay.
person. Dana Beal, I really want to give a shout out to Dana Beal though, because he knows this stuff and he's been promoting it since before it was ever popular or that anyone even knew what Ibogaine was. And he was like the crazy guy in the back of drug policy conferences saying stuff about Ibogaine. And now, like right now, he's actually, I think, in jail for cannabis
Really?
stuff. And he's like probably in his 70s or 80s. He's like old school New York City yippie movement, if you
Yeah, yeah.
know that.
Abby
And
Hoffman, yeah.
so he's been really vocal, and I'm just happy for him that like what he's been talking about this whole time is actually seeing some and positive attention.
Except for the fact he's in prison right now. Jesus.
He'll get out. It's not like a lifelong sentence. He's been there before. He's been there, done that a few times.
Oh, wow. Hey, we'll put this in the show notes for people to be able to try and connect. He must have written stuff about this or whatever. Okay, so we'll need, just send over his proper name, spelling, and all that. Yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah.
Look, I know a couple who, and this is a number of years ago, but they had a regular occupation, and they're in Canada, and they would bring people they were connected to, in Mexico, this is something that's available for people to be taken through Ibogaine journeys for whatever reason. But they started doing it in Canada, and I am personally friends, and the success rate, and it was all about addiction. The success rate was, there's not a world in which I believe they were not telling the truth. It was extraordinary. I don't know, 75%, something crazy, where there wasn't, people weren't going back to heroin or whatever it was that they were doing. Yeah, so, and I've met people recently who've had similar experiences, and some of them life-changing, and it had nothing to do with, they weren't looking to cure addiction. They were looking to, cure their trauma, basically, right? Which is what ultimately all psychedelics, to one degree or another, do. So yeah, Ibogaine's really an interesting thing, and really interesting that was a lead. The president couldn't even pronounce Ibogaine properly. So, it's like somebody's saying, hey, this would be a good thing to do. And hopefully, I'm sure there's a lot of different reasoning for that, but hopefully this will help, because there's a lot of, really
opioid crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I will say, though, that I don't want to treat Ibogaine or any psychedelic as a panacea, and especially whether you go in for an addiction or other trauma or symptoms of a trauma. And it's, there are people who, go in for Ibogaine, but that they come back to their regular lives and there's no infrastructure holding their sort of new sense of self together. And if they're going back to the same friends and the same routine, they're more at risk of going back to the substance also. So just think that any psychedelic recourse should come also with an integration plan.
Mm-hmm. Which is, in terms of representing Ram Dass, this is exactly, and because I've talked to you about it, and we're still in the planning stage to do the right thing in relation to helping people integrate from these very powerful experiences. And so I'm glad, you pointed that out in the book, that part of it is just as important. Because and I think you said in the book at some point, the psychonauts go, hey, no, just doing it every weekend or whatever. The frequency of it is, you're going to learn something at some point, It's too blasé and not measured enough for the reality of how powerful these things are. So, yeah, what is a psychedelic? That's how you start the book.
Yeah, what is a psychedelic? Officially, you could say it's a category of substance that occasions psychedelic effects. Officially the term means mind manifesting. That's the etymological definition of psychedelic. And I'll say that I think it was Ben Malcom, who's otherwise known as the Spirit Pharmacist. He's a good person to contact for questions about contraindications between psychedelics and other medications that you might be on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's great. I highly recommend Spirit
Okay, that somebody else will put in the show notes with the right spelling of his name, etc.
Yeah. He posted once on Instagram that psychedelic is a little bit of a misnomer, and really these should be called psychosomatodelics or something, because it's not only that you're manifesting or magnifying whatever is going on in the mind, but also coming into a different sense of your body and a felt somatic awareness. So, we say that psychedelics are sort of like non-specific amplifiers. So whatever is happening inside in your inner world, whether it's mind, body, spirit, whatever, is now amplified on the psychedelic. My own personal definition that I use in my writings, and not just in this book, but other books that I've written and so forth, is based on the definition, or based on the way that Albert Hofmann, who's the chemist who originally synthesized LSD, called it medicine for the soul. And so I think that applies not only to acid, but other psychedelic substances as well, where, typically they might reduce activity in like in the ego part of the brain. And when the ego goes offline, or at least is reduced, the question is like, what's your primary identity? Like, what's your actual essence? And that's the soul, and that's your sort of like connection to a more mystical level of reality and connection to God or nature, community, whatever. So I like to say that that the psychedelic experience really is one that is a soul-centered experience.
Yeah. That aligns with Ram Dass, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm influenced by him at least a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah, we didn't even say anything about that. I guess we should. I'm just assuming, when did we do a podcast? A couple of years probably now, right? Something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. As I said, Madison's dad, Bruce Margolin, is a major attorney in the defending people who had been busted for cannabis for a long time, starting with Tim Leary. He didn't start with him, but he did defend him way back when. And so he and I, we come from the same boat that went to India and came back in the early 70s. And of course, I've known Madison since she's alive.
Before born. Yes.
Before he was born, yeah. But I think that people like me, like you go to psychedelics were discovered in the 60s. I'm like, no, they weren't. You're kidding. I thought they were. We had the only thing we knew about was Hoffman, basically, back then. But then we started to get into what I consider to be the most important thing that people can take away from this book, or from just getting a lot more familiar with what a psychedelic is and the power of it. And that is with our indigenous elders, period. And to that, yeah, maybe speak to that a bit, and the importance of what that is. A very complex subject, because there are some groups, indigenous groups, who are not happy about the, white people sort of, taking that and using it in a business way, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I'm actually actively looking for the right community to visit. Hopefully this summer, really wanting to go to the jungle and experience, and kind of be with a tribe, basically, because I want to learn what their relationship looks like with nature, with plants, with each other, with music, with spirituality. And you could say that I've spent a lot of my life sampling different spiritualities, growing up in the communities surrounding Ram Dass and among devotees of Maharaji. And, one thing that I really want to bring forward is that, again, your question is good, because building off the Ibogaine question, is that doing psychedelics under the stewardship of an indigenous culture is equally legitimate to doing it in a clinical context. And I should say it's also legitimate to do it at a Grateful Dead show or in other sort of like contexts as well. But what I really want to get at is that the way that the tribes or the indigenous cultures regard these medicines is through community, through song, through prayer, through connection to nature, through reciprocity. And those are all values that I think even the clinical world can borrow and emulate as they design their trials. And, the fact that like the clinical standard is that you're with an eye mask and headphones in a room, not moving the entire time, might be ludicrous in some ways, in comparison or in contrast rather to, the way that you see it done in a ceremonial context, for instance, right? And I think for me, having sat, thank God, in a number of ceremonies that have really influenced who I am, I sometimes joke that like the medicine is the Trojan horse that gets you to the real medicine. And the real medicine is being in that environment, in that sort of like sacred space container, again, with music, prayer, community, and so forth. And that's as healing as taking the physical substance. And I think another thing that the more indigenous perspective brings forward is like this integral relationship between what's healing and what is spiritual. And to sort of divorce like spirituality and wellness from each other is completely false, at least in my perspective, and I'm sure in many other people's perspectives too. And I think that's something also, to a degree, Ram Dass really, probably had to grapple with, coming from Harvard and coming from like the more clinical Western perspective on mental health and the mind and, medicine, and, that launching him on a path of finding spirituality. And I'd say like his whole integration, quote unquote, of going so deep into his psychedelic research was then going deep into spirituality. I think they go hand in hand, and I don't think there's a way to separate them healthily. And so even if you don't believe in God, or if you don't believe in, all of this like mystical stuff, that's totally fine. But I think what we learn through the psychedelic experience is that there are layers to reality or into ourselves that we might have not known about or experienced in our mundane lives. And oftentimes the explanation for that layered reality and the way to maintain an awareness of it in your everyday life comes through spiritual practice and spiritual philosophy. So, I'm really grateful that whereas before in your generation, I think everyone was going to India. I think in my generation, everyone's going to South America, and it's all good. And I think there's, obviously plant medicine in every corner of the world, and every culture has a lineage of engaging with plants. Like that's just what it is to be human. And only in like more Western societies where we've been like, in a way, dehumanized thanks to capitalist constructs and consumerism, and like kind of just like not being in touch with our natural sense of our own humanity. Absent that, I think everyone comes from a lineage that has a relationship with plants and plant medicine.
Mm. When I look through the I guess it's more the chapter around ayahuasca, because I guess that's more commonly associated with indigenous groups, and that's many Westerners go over. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fake ones there, just like in India, like most of the sadhus, quote unquote, are popping around India are pretty fake, or fake is one word. Another word is they need a job. This is a decent job. You can get money and you advise people and so on. We have it here in the West.
I wouldn't say that spirituality is like automatically good or bad. So like if you're going to a tribe, or if you're going to a sadhu, or if you're going to a rabbi, or if you're going to any sort of like spiritual leader, or even a therapist who's dealing in wellness, like just because they're dealing with that area of expertise doesn't mean they're doing it in a righteous way.
Right. And, some people get in trouble because of that. On both sides of this equation, with just going to India and meeting up with gurus and teachers and all of that, plenty of untoward stuff has happened there. And in the same way, people going over and getting into situations, especially in South America, that are really sometimes scary. I mean, I've heard of a lot of different things that are At the same time, how about this? I know, brujos, they become friends and we talk, and they're doing stuff in Peru and elsewhere. And they say, by the way, this brujo that I was working with in South America had a picture of Neem Karoli Baba. More than once. I heard that more than once. And that to me is so wild. How the hell do they connect there? Probably through Westerners, but still.
Yes, I love that. Now I want to know who they are. Maybe if I end up going, I'd rather go to a devotee of Maharaji.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what struck me, though, in this chapter was they're called the Shipibo Konibo.
Mhm.
And the picture that's there of these two women, indigenous women, that alone could give someone confidence. Okay, whatever they've been practicing and however they've been doing it for all these, centuries, probably thousands of years, you just look in their eyes and you see, okay, this is something that is to aspire to, for sure, while at the same time, no one should take, and I think you're pretty good, maybe you can address this, you cannot take any of this in any frivolous manner because it is so powerful. And look, for us and everybody who went over to India, it wasn't to go over to India and have a good time in India, although plenty of us did. It was specifically to meet this being, and here's address this question. Ram Dass went there because he couldn't stand going up and down on psychedelic trips anymore. Somebody must know there's a way that this won't happen. And so he went to India searching for that map. He called it that map of consciousness. I needed to find that, he said. And then he found it and he came back, and the rest is history. But the interrelation between Neem Karoli Baba and Ram Dass's psychedelic journey, he didn't just toss it off. Do you know who Mayor Baba is? You heard of Mayor Baba? Yeah. Don't worry, be happy. I loved him. He was the first thing I ever heard. Oh God, that's great. I don't want to worry. I want to be happy. But he was against taking psychedelics. He actually told Ram Dass, and Ram Dass communicated with him, and Ram Dass said, look, these have been I don't know how he said it, but very productive for me as a human being. And he said, all right, well, just 5 more times, that's it. You shouldn't take it any more than that. Ram Dass did not follow that advice. But Neem Karoli Baba, being who he is to this day, he let himself be used as a sounding board for what these entheogens can do. And I've been wanting all the way as we talk to say, this is no advertisement to go out and take psychedelics. And we just said it's very, very powerful substances, whichever one there is that you're taking. You are it's revealing true nature, but there's a big logjam between that reveal and your conscious mind. Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I one thing I want to say is going back to this original, or the definition that I use based on medicine for the soul when we talk about psychedelics, is if you hear all the stories of people who are with Maharaji, they were having psychedelic experiences just by being in his presence, or by having their consciousness somehow connect with his consciousness, even if they weren't in his presence, physically speaking. So, and, I think Parvati writes about that in the Love Everyone book, and whatever, there's all sorts of resources to hear about how Maharaji himself was the psychedelic, or is a psychedelic. I don't even was, because he's beyond time and space in a lot of ways. And that's another aspect of the psychedelic experience, is feeling beyond time and space, right? Connecting to a type of consciousness that is that is beyond the mundane, that is like kind of in this transcendent, kind of loving awareness plane of existence. So, with regard to like what, Mayor Baba and Maharaji or others have said about psychedelics, like, this whole thing about coming up and down. And I think especially Maharaji, for instance, like I didn't get to meet him in person, obviously, but my concept of him is that like there wasn't a lot of ego, right? So his awareness, he was that like pure consciousness, like loving awareness, right? Ram, that's so classically spoken about. So when Ram Dass gave him acid, and there's like the story that, he didn't get high, or maybe he did get high, but then said like, you can, it shows you, it takes you into the room with Christ or Christ consciousness, but you can't stay. My perspective on it is that like Maharaji was, when you're so already beyond your ego, what can these substances really do to you? Like, that's, and so,
Exactly.
what was that?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think like, I sometimes joke like ayahuasca's cool, but like, have you tried doing yoga every day? Like for me, that's way more profound. And I find way more shifts when I'm regularly practicing yoga than doing another ceremony, or whatever other medicines are on the menu. So like that in and of itself. And again, I think it's the people don't want to hear that like the actual medicine is the discipline and is just the practice. Like when we talk about like spiritual practice, it's the practice of doing it day in and day out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of these spiritual masters have figured that out, whether through their own practice or through maybe like the, I would say like talented consciousness of connecting to God in that way, in a way that maybe isn't always available to regular people, but that's why, they're chosen to be teachers, like from a spiritual perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
Did I answer the question? I feel like I'm just sort of rambling
No,
on.
it was good. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's exactly how we are going and have been. We've been doing some representation of Ram Dass's perspective on spirituality, science, and psychedelic insight. And we're going to carry it further. But that's exactly what it is that we're sharing with people. I mean, we have, collectively a lot of experience with a lot of different methodologies, spiritual quote unquote methodologies, and they include the opening that psychedelics provided for us. Yeah. So I think that that combination and having that perspective is tremendously important. That this is something that is integrated with what you do on a daily basis. This isn't, I got to wait till next weekend where, I'll get another experience that will tell me something else that I didn't know before. Fine, but at least punctuate all of it with a daily practice. And there are so many different ways that, you're doing it through yoga. For me, it is chanting. That's a major practice for me, and meditation. So yeah, this is super, super important for sure.
And I'll say also that if you, like I often tell people, like the integration of a psychedelic experience starts with the preparation. So the practice that you have in place already, you should do it before you go into the experience. It'll sort of like prepare your mind, body, spirit. And even while you're tripping or, like under the influence, it could be really beautiful to draw on yoga or chanting or meditation or whatever. And then I find that it becomes the perfect bridge, kind of like a souvenir from the psychedelic experience into your integration in regular life. So when I practice yoga on, while I'm under the influence, it like, even just a few postures, like I feel like the practice itself is infused with like that psychedelic flavor. And it, in my regular practice day to day, it kind of like reminds me of that just a little bit. And so it's a very sweet bridge.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So I know you, this is another in Yiddish they'd say mittendrin. I know that you work with psychedelics with Jewish people, Orthodox Jewish people, and now I am not Orthodox Jewish, Chassid, right? But I'm like, and we've talked a little bit about it before, but I'm like, really? That's really happening with the tefillin on and the whole 9 yards?
Sometimes they bring along the tefillin, not all the time, or the talis or whatever. I try to encourage them. I'll actually say, like, bring this along. It could be really nice. When I talk about integration accessories or things, like how nice is that if you're doing tefillin every day and it now starts to remind you of that experience. But yeah, I would say that, like, in that world in particular, in the Jewish world in general, there's a lot of conversation and practice around psychedelics, and this has been building and building and building. We didn't, this generation did not come up with it. Like, you could say, like, in modern times, Reb Zalman, who was actually a good friend of Ram Dass, maybe he was like one of the more modern day pioneers. And, you could also look at the history of the religion and say, well, there's all this evidence for altered states and people kind of having practices that are in nature psychedelic. But yeah, right now I would say in like the Hasidic world, in the Orthodox world, there's a lot of impulse toward healing. And I find that also the ceremony structure maps very well into Jewish formats or into Jewish environments, because there's already a predilection toward prayer, community, chanting, song, being in a space that puts God as the centerpiece, or whether it's the centerpiece or just your own personal relationship to spirituality and figuring that out in a community context. I mean, this is ceremony. And so often, the music might be like nigunim or like old world Jewish tunes. Sometimes they also bring in indigenous tunes, but there's a very beautiful like merging going on there. And in general, also like people going for one-on-one sessions or doing it on camping trips. And it's just, I would say low-key revolutionizing that sector of the Jewish world.
And I like that thing you pointed to of some Arab people who were carrying the message forward to their people, and in a very tell us about that. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess over the years, like, I've been involved in things like I co-founded something called the Jewish Psychedelics Summit. Obviously, my last book was on Judaism and psychedelics, but in having Jewish Psychedelics Summit, I think a few months or a year or something after, there was the Mormon Psychedelic Summit, right, for people who are coming from like hardcore Mormon backgrounds and kind of like grappling with any sort of religious trauma or just spirituality, that perspective. And at some point also along the way, I've connected with people from Arab psychedelic societies and so forth. And I did, I can't say I know like the Islamic law so well to know if it's like kosher. I think there is a little bit, I think Islam more than Judaism is stricter when it comes to like altering the mind or using substance to like curtain the mind, I think would be the translation for it. But that being said, there is a lot of interest, maybe more low key than what I've seen in the Jewish world, in Arab and Muslim communities, both Muslim Arab and Christian Arab. And I've also done a lot of research and writing around, especially in Palestinian communities, the fact that I split my time between Israel and New York. In my recent experience, I've spoken to people coming from the West Bank who are doing underground ceremonies or participated in
Palestinian people.
Palestinian, yeah. So there's actually a project. It's called Ripples Alliance, I think. I don't know I think it's called Ripples. And a few years ago, they did before Ripples officially became an organization, the people behind it did a above ground ceremony among Israelis and Palestinians in Spain. A series of ceremonies, so different cohorts, ayahuasca, And you know, so I got to I did a story on that, and I interviewed a lot of people from that who were participated both on the Arab or on the Palestinian and Israeli side of things. But I've also just seen in my own experience being in the land that there is a current, even in Palestinian culture, like that's interested in this stuff, but it's a lot more low key. It's a lot more, there's a lot more like modesty around that. It's not so, you could get in a lot of trouble, whether in their community or, there have been things that I think like there's a lot of fear because I've heard things like soldiers, like IDF soldiers, kind of like going undercover, like with people on like drug cases and like basically like there's people who are afraid of like being involved with drugs at all because of the way that it's been like that particular like legal sector has been like weaponized
Right.
through the conflict. So it's very touchy, but
Wow. God, consider in terms of people who need it the most healing to use these entheogens that way. It's just terrible.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're not the IDF. They're not used. I don't think they're like making like cases out of psychedelic substances. I think it's just more like using drugs as like a Trojan horse to deal with other things, like in these like undercover ways, makes it so that like any drug is like the society is like, more suspicious of drug culture at large. But
Yeah.
I will also say that like, just when people ask me about things like, can psychedelics heal the Middle East or what about psychedelics in Israel, Palestine, whatever, I'll often say that like not everyone who needs psychedelic healing, especially in like acute trauma situations, is going to have access to it. But I do think there's something to tapping into like the ethos of psychedelic consciousness that is equally valuable. And I think one thing that I just want to put down is that psychedelics can enable us to hold multiple truths at the same time. And I think in conflict zones and war zones and whatever in that situation and others, like that's like an invaluable perspective to be able to hold. And I'd say that is kind of psychedelic in nature.
Yeah. The one thing also you talk about is basically psychedelics for religious leaders. That would seem to me to be extraordinarily important for people. Hopefully, one would consider that they're using these psychedelics to go to further, at the very least, understand who they are and understand how they are relating with their congregation, in this case, with their congregation, right? Yeah, so how is that, do you feel like that is something? Have you seen that happen with individuals in that position where they do this, self-investigation through psychedelics to further enhance their ability to help people heal and open?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, that study at Hopkins is funny because it's in
Oh, the
order to,
one that just happened, right? They came up with it last fall
yeah,
with,
like it's been ongoing for a while, and
yeah.
and yeah, they were recruiting religious leaders from different religious professionals from different religious traditions to do psilocybin. And one of the prerequisites to qualify for the study was that you had never tripped before. So you could not have any psychedelic experience. And I think for that reason, I heard that a lot of rabbis were disqualified, which I just think is
That's fun.
but yeah, but for instance, like I did a story on Zach Kamenetz, who was a study subject in that trial, and later he formed, I co-founded Jewish Psychedelic Summit with him and our colleague Natalie Ginsburg, and then he formed an organization, Shefa, that deals with psychedelic Jewish integration and classes and things like that. And in my experience of talking to religious professionals, I'd say mostly rabbis or other sort of Jewish religious leaders who have done psychedelics, is that it, I think helps us understand I think it gives like experiential credence to a lot of the things that religion already talks about.
That's good.
And because if you're like a religious professional, you probably have the language to talk about mysticism in a way that maybe lay people don't. And so that study in particular, I think, is giving scientists a greater understanding of the quote unquote mystical experience as defined by psychedelic scientists. And what they've found is there's a correlation, I won't say causation, but a correlation between the degree to which someone is having a mystical experience and the magnitude of healing that they might experience in relation to that psychedelic journey. And so I think a religious professional's ability to deal in matters of mysticism in a way that's practical and um, and in a way that I would say practically is brought down into helping people deal with their mental and physical and other sort of health issues and wellness. So, and Ram Dass is one of the best examples of that. As just someone who understands psychedelics and understands mysticism, and I'd say a lot of people have experienced great mental and physical and wellness benefits from just coming into contact with Ram Dass's teachings.
Yeah. Yeah, he was certainly adept at that. One thing that we got and brought back, from the East through Maharaji and all that, and what Ram Dass really emphasized was not taking yourself so seriously, right? This is a very serious matter. It's a very serious, it is from one to another very serious substances, and so on. But we tend to just take this out of context and drop in from an ego place, however subtle it may be, around this subject. So just one, I don't remember if I even ever told you the story, but there was somebody who, one of us, we were over there with Maharaji, and he decided to take acid and go see Maharaji. A few people did that, right? So he went, and he was there, and actually was there with our great mentor, who wrote the, in my mind, best book about what that Neem Karoli Baba thing is, called By Your Grace. Anyhow, he was interpreting for this person. And they sat down, and he sat down, and they just were talking about worldly stuff or something. He said he was so far into the extraordinary planes of consciousness that he was seeing in front of it, represented by this being in a blanket. He got lost. So, and then they started to get up, and they were going to go away. You can't have the universe go away. So he said, "Can I come?" They said, "Sure." Never said a word about it whatsoever. About not that long after, about a month after, one of Maharaji's Indian devotees, actually a family, said to her husband, "Do you know that stuff that Ram Dass gave to Maharaji? LSD? I'd like to try it," she said. He went, "What, are you crazy?" "No, I mean, I can. You better go talk to him yourself and ask for permission." So she went and met up with him and told him she wanted to try acid, right? He said he made mention of the guy who had taken acid and hung out with them. And I'm not going to tell the name because it's a little too personal, but he mentioned that guy's acid. He said, "I don't know anything about it. Go ask so-and-so." And that whole time that he had this trip with Maharaji, never said a word. And let me tell you, every day that we were there, he would tell us shit that nobody knew about, and it was going to happen in the future. So there was no doubt that we knew.
Right.
He knew what was going on there. Talk about. We don't have much time left, but talk about. And this to me is another important thing that I'm glad is in the book: spiritual emergence versus spiritual emergency.
Yeah. Like I said, spirituality, I wouldn't say is inherently like good or bad. It just is, right? Physicality, it is. It's good, it's bad, it's neutral, right? It's the same idea. And so, of course, psychedelics can can open your consciousness up to experience degrees and layers of reality and mysticism that are not ordinarily accessible in regular life. And that can be very inspiring. And you could call that a spiritual emergence, especially if you use that newfound awareness to place you on a particular path of devotion and practice and so forth. That's one direction it can go. And the other direction could be that you feel maybe equally inspired, in awe, or terrified, or whatever. And God forbid it sort of peters on or teeters on like mania, psychosis, delusion, a lot of the sort of like mental health crises that can come also from psychedelic use, especially for people who might have predisposition to mental health instability, or people who do it in very like unsavory settings that don't really promote that level of wellness and health that could come from it. It can be very scary and destabilizing. So again, you really, really, really need to like assess your set and setting. That being said, spiritual emergency, the classic like example would be someone who comes out of a psychedelic experience and thinks that they're the Messiah.
Yeah.
And they are like under this like illusions of grandeur and delusions about the workings of the world. And, it often, unfortunately, coincides with this like ego inflation as well, and so just because ego during a trip, it often bounces back, maybe even more so than you had it before,
exactly,
in the aftermath of psychedelic experience. So that's just like something to be aware of. And if you, I've unfortunately seen a number of people, personal friends, go in and out of psych wards following bad, I don't want to say bad, but like just, psychedelic experiences that were not fruitful in that way.
Yeah, no, and it's fairly common, and which is why, as you said earlier, doing spiritual practices alongside on a daily basis to allow for integration will also help with the perspective that when something like that, your mind really takes you over and you can't, you have no space. It's very suffocating. It's a very terrifying experience. But if you have some basic practice, you'll be able to at least give it enough space to let go. So that is important.
I would say there's like a very classic way of talking about this in Kabbalah, which is or and kalim, like light and vessels to hold the light. So without the vessel in place, like it's like too much light. It's like a light bulb that cracks open. So you really need the containment, and spiritual practice, like doing something diligently, whether it's meditation, yoga, chanting, whatever, is what gives you the kalim, the vessels to be able to contain and hold the light without it like blasting you open in a way that's like, just unstable.
Yeah, and unsustainable. Yeah, no, absolutely. And last thing to say, you do talk about integration. You have one thing on it, the phases of integration. And I like the idea, this isn't like we're planning to do something to bring people together to help them first understand what that integration could possibly mean to them after they have this extraordinarily powerful experience. But also, we want to share the different paths that people can take to do what we're speaking to right now, what you mentioned before, which is doing it, not waiting, okay, I'm going to do all these psychedelics, and then, yeah, maybe I'll go try some, practices. But the act of, the intention, rather, to do it as one thing. There is only one spirituality is not there's spirituality, and then there's my work life, my family life, and children, whatever. There's only one thing, and once we wrap everything around that one thing, life becomes way more integrated, beyond psychedelics or beyond anything. There's a great line in this, one of the major holy books in India is called the Ramayana, which you know about. And it says just like, wrap all of your attachments, all of your fears, all of your insecurities around the feet of Ram, universal intelligence, however you want to term that thing. You just wrap it around there. And that is what the real good fortune, nachas of bhakti is, that devotion that comes from within, that's not taken over by ego at all. And it's an offering. So that is just such a powerful way to see the world. It really is. From that place.
Reminds me of a line that in Hebrew that goes, I place God before me always. And so it's the same idea as like to always like God or a name of God or whatever as like your focal point for when you do anything, and you put that in service to the divine, or with the divine holding it as well. So I think really like orienting around whether, again, I think this is like can be controversial for people who don't believe in God, but like having some sort of thing that's above and beyond and transcending you as central to your perspective.
Yeah. In other words, believing your story, your thoughts, your habitual patterns, your neurotic shit, that's difficult to go move forward with those belief systems. And that's, putting a wedge in that is what doing practices help. A psychedelic can help for sure, under the right circumstances and community. We haven't talked about that at all. That kind of support is just such an essential thing for moving forward on any path, really, on any path.
Yeah, definitely.
Great, you did this book too. I like it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny because I wrote the book. Basically, like Shelby and I split up the work where I did.
Oh, really?
First, yeah, and then she did kind of like the second draft edited version. So like, anyways, it's been sort of like I worked on it so long ago, and moved on, writing another book, a third book right now, and
You are? Oh.
In life that I'm all of a sudden this book comes out and I'm like, all right, this
This got to represent now.
Yeah. It's definitely a little bit of a trip past time and space with this book. So yeah.
Yeah, really. Well, I always like talking to you. Aside from our relationship, beyond all this, is your commitment to your faith that you come from. I have not had that. Once I went to India, that dissolved, although your father and I would go around and do stuff around Passover and all that. That's another story that I don't even remember if I told you. But your perspective is really great, Madison. It really is. And, carry it forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll say one thing, which is that someone I interviewed for my upcoming book said that Hinduism, whatever, indigenous traditions, all these like other traditions are like the metal detector for finding those same things in our own tradition. So, I never, growing up, like, as much as my father exposed me to kirtan and the Hindu thing, like, it's not like he took me to India. Like, he put me into like a Jewish preschool. And
Yeah.
so, like, that was his choice for, I didn't, that was him.
Yeah.
So, but it did really spark a lot of questions about like, my exposure to spiritual practice and a degree of connection that is so palpable, especially in the satsang, and wanting to know again, like, is that from where we're coming from? Like, is that available? Is that possible? What does that look
Mm,
like? So,
mm,
it's to everyone's credit, and I'm sure also through Maharaji's grace that I'm even on the path that I'm on
mm.
myself.
So, last little story. I was in the Himalayas. I brought my mother to India to introduce her to Siddhiman and all my family and my life there. We had a wonderful journey. But one time, as part of that, she and I and K.C. Tiwari, one of the great mentors of ours from India, and himself a very high yogi that not many people knew, but we did a movie called Brilliant Disguise, which is great for people. So we're sitting there late at night, just beautiful in the Himalaya, the moon shining on the mountain, one of those kind of scenes. And he says, it's great you came to India and you got into Eastern philosophy or whatever, but you cannot abandon your original faith. And, I was a little bit, that. And he said, you must know, he said to my mother and I, you must know a Hebrew prayer. You could just, sing. I'd just like to hear something, right? He'd never heard anything, no Hebrew, nothing in his entire life, right? But he wanted to, so my mother and I, and by the way, one of the extraordinary things about him, he would be able to go into deep samadhi, meaning deep absorbed trance with no pulse, no breath, and this happened right in front of me a lot because I spent as much time as I could with him. Anyhow, my mother and I said, okay. And my mother was no big Jew either, she was more cultural, but she knew. So we said, okay, how about Ein Kelohenu? Ein Kelohenu, there's nothing but the one, basically. Ein Kelo, we maybe 3 notes in, there he is, completely gone from
Wow.
just us doing Ein Kelohenu, Ein
So,
Kadonenu,
wow,
That's the reality, right? Of the, when Maharaji said there's only one, the Subek, there's one thing going on, nothing but one, and of course, Ein Kelohenu, nothing but the one, right? Anyhow, we're going to close on that note. I so fondly remember. And again, thanks so much, Madison. And this book will have links to, you have to send me all the stuff we talked about and different links to different people, the book. And we'll have it, everybody, in the show notes. You go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling, and you will catch all of these links and notes and everything we've been talking about. And you can get, this book is really good to have around. Absolutely great. So
thank you, Raghu.
yeah, we'll see you next time, Martin.
See you next time. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks,
Thank you, Be
Madison.
Here Now Network. Yeah.
Okay. Ram Ram, everybody.